The neural interface crackled as Zethkar adjusted the translation matrix one final time. Around the briefing chamber, representatives from 17 different species sat in varying states of attention, their forms ranging from the crystalline beauty of the Veltari to the writhing tentacles of the Deep Ones. But every eye, sensor, or sensory organ was focused on the human standing at the center of the room. Commander Sarah Chen was unremarkable by galactic standards. She stood barely 5.5 feet tall, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the standard-issue gray uniform of the Terran Defense Corps. No bioluminescent displays, no intimidating size, no natural weapons. Just soft pink skin, small white teeth, and eyes the color of an old Earth sky. "The Devourers have taken Kepler 442b, she said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. 30 million Altarian colonists, gone in 72 hours. Zethkar felt his secondary heart skip a beat. He had seen the recordings from other Devourer attacks, the complete conversion of living matter into their hive mind biomass, the screaming that echoed across subspace until the last consciousness was absorbed. His people, the proud warrior race of Kethmoran, had lost 3 colony worlds to these monsters. Each time, their finest soldiers had died in meaningless charges against an enemy that simply absorbed their violence and grew stronger. Intelligence suggests their next target is the Proxima Centauri trade hub, Chen continued. If they take it, they control the shipping lanes between the core worlds and the outer rim, 200 billion souls cut off from supply lines. General Thaxmer of the Hegemony Defense Force raised one of his forearms. Commander Chen, with respect, we have tried everything. Our battle cruisers, the Veltari's phase weapons, even the Zephyrian mine bombs. Nothing stops them. They adapt too quickly. Chen nodded slowly. You're right, conventional warfare won't work. That's why we're not going conventional. She tapped her wrist device, and a holographic display materialized above the table. It showed a detailed schematic of a Devourer hiveship, its organic curves pulsing with bioluminescent veins. The Devourers have one weakness, she said. They process emotional energy as efficiently as they process matter. Fear, rage, despair, it all feeds them. But there's one emotion they can't metabolize properly. She paused, scanning the room. Controlled fury, not blind rage, but cold, calculated anger focused through discipline and training. Zethkar leaned forward. His translation implant struggled with the human concept she was describing. In his language, anger was Thrakmer, the red heat of battle madness. But what Chen described had no direct translation. It was anger that burned like ice, fury that sharpened rather than clouded the mind. You're proposing a joint strike force, said Ambassador Velrani, her crystalline form chiming softly. But human military doctrine is primitive compared to most of our forces. No offense intended. Chen smiled, and something in that expression made Zethkar's combat instincts stir. None taken, but primitive doesn't mean ineffective. We've been refining the art of controlled violence for thousands of years. Every human soldier learns to channel their anger into precision. She gestured to the hologram, which zoomed in on the hive ship's central core. Standard doctrine says you attack the perimeter, work your way in. We're going to do the opposite. Drop teams directly into the heart of their command structure while they're busy adapting to our conventional assault. Suicide, growled General Thaxmer. The core is protected by living walls that can adapt to any weapon we possess. Any weapon you possess, Chen corrected, but not any weapon we can make together. The next hour was unlike anything Zethkar had experienced in 40 years of military service. Chen laid out a battle plan that violated every principle of galactic warfare he had ever learned. Instead of overwhelming firepower, she proposed surgical strikes. Instead of technological supremacy, she emphasized psychological warfare. Most shocking of all, she suggested that the various species soldiers train together, learning to fight as integrated units rather than separate armies. The Devourers expect us to fight like we always have, she explained. Separate forces with separate objectives, each using our traditional strengths. They've already adapted to that, but they've never faced a truly integrated response. Zethkar found himself speaking before he had consciously decided to. You want us to fight like humans. Chen turned to him, those blue eyes studying his face with uncomfortable intensity. No, Major Zethkar, I want us to fight better than humans, better than any of our species have fought alone. She stepped closer, and he caught a scent that his implant identified as determination mixed with something else, something predatory. I want us to show them what happens when you threaten our people. The word "our" echoed strangely in the chamber. Zethkar realized that Chen wasn't speaking as a human representing humanity. She was speaking as a soldier representing everyone in that room, everyone in the galaxy who had lost someone to the Devourers. Over the following days, Zethkar found himself assigned to Training Group 7, composed of humans, 3 other Kethmorani warriors, 2 Veltari technicians, a pair of hegemony heavy assault specialists, and 1 very unhappy Zephyrian Sion named Riltha who kept muttering about primitive mammalian thought patterns. The training facility was a converted asteroid, its interior carved into maze-like corridors that supposedly mimicked the interior of a Devourer hive ship. The humans had insisted on Earth-standard gravity and atmosphere, which put most of the other species at a slight disadvantage. Zethkar's people were used to lighter gravity, and the oxygen levels made him feel slightly intoxicated. Their human instructor was a compact woman named Sergeant Martinez who spoke with an accent Zethkar's implant couldn't identify. She was even smaller than Commander Chen, but when she moved, it was with a fluid precision that reminded him of the blade dancers of his homeworld. "Forget everything you know about military formation," she announced on their first day. "The Devourers don't fight in lines or use traditional tactics. They flow like water, adapt like living metal, and think with a collective intelligence that processes information faster than any individual mind." She led them through a series of exercises that seemed designed more to frustrate than educate. Instead of teaching them to use their weapons more effectively, she taught them to move without thinking. Instead of drilling them on tactical formations, she had them practice fighting in groups where each member's natural abilities complemented the others. "Zethkar," she called out during one session, "you're thinking like a Kethmorani warrior. Honorable single combat, personal glory, death before dishonor. All very admirable, also completely useless against an enemy that doesn't understand honor." She gestured to Specialist Kowalski, one of the human soldiers. He was young, probably barely past his species' adulthood, with pale skin and nervous eyes. "Kowalski here looks like he couldn't fight his way out of a supply closet, but watch." What followed was a demonstration that challenged everything Zethkar thought he understood about combat. Kowalski moved like he was afraid, hesitating, stumbling, appearing to panic. But every stumble put him in the perfect position to strike. Every moment of apparent fear was actually careful observation. When he finally attacked the training dummy, it was with a series of moves that would have been impossible for anyone who hadn't spent those precious seconds calculating angles and timing. "Human combat doctrine," Martinez explained, "is based on the principle that victory goes to whoever makes the fewest mistakes, not whoever is strongest or fastest. We train our soldiers to think while they fight, to use their fear instead of being controlled by it." Riltha, the Zephyrian, tilted her elongated head. "This is why your species survived first contact with the galaxy despite being technologically inferior. You fight like cowards, but calculated cowards." Martinez's smile was sharp enough to cut hull plating. "We prefer the term pragmatic. Dead heroes don't win wars." The training intensified over the following weeks. They practiced fighting in environments where their natural abilities were compromised. They learned to coordinate attacks across species barriers, using each other's strengths to compensate for weaknesses. Most challenging of all, they learned to maintain what the humans called combat discipline, the ability to remain clear-headed and purposeful even when everything around them was chaos. Zethkar discovered that humans possessed an unusual relationship with violence. Unlike his own people, who embraced the fury of battle, or the hegemony forces, who fought with cold mechanical precision, humans seemed to dance on a knife's edge between savagery and control. They could be utterly ruthless without losing their ability to think strategically. During one particularly intense training session, he found himself paired with Private Williams, a human who couldn't have been out of basic training for more than a standard year. They were practicing close-quarters combat in a simulated hive corridor, facing holographic devourer constructs that reacted with the speed and adaptability of the real thing. The first wave nearly overwhelmed them. Zethkar fought as he had been trained, with the flowing swordwork of his people, while Williams used the human technique of controlled aggression. They were quickly surrounded. "We need to move," Williams shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The constructs had them boxed in. That was when Zethkar saw something that would haunt his dreams for years afterward. Williams' face went completely blank for just a moment, as if some switch had been thrown in his mind. Then he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the expression of someone who had just realized that his enemies had made a terrible mistake. Williams moved like liquid death. Not fast, the constructs were faster. Not strong, they were stronger. But he moved with a purpose that seemed to bend reality around him. Every shot he fired hit exactly where it needed to. Every step he took put him in the perfect position for the next move. He fought like he could see the future. More unsettling was the way he fought with Zethkar. Without discussion, without apparent communication, Williams seemed to know exactly where the Kethmorani warrior would be at any given moment. He covered angles that Zethkar couldn't see, created openings that perfectly matched his partner's fighting style. When the last construct fell, Williams was back to being a nervous young soldier who stammered when addressed by his superiors. But for those few minutes, he had been something else entirely. Something that fought not with passion or duty, but with a cold joy that found perfect expression in violence. "How did you do that?" Zethkar asked later in the mess hall. Williams shrugged, poking at his food with obvious distaste. "Do what? We just fought like we trained." "No, you fought like you knew what I was going to do before I did it." The young human looked uncomfortable. "I guess. I just paid attention. You move different when you're about to strike high versus low. Your shoulder shifts, and when you're planning a defensive move, you plant your back foot differently." He took a bite of what the synthesizer claimed was beef stew. "Humans are pretty good at reading body language. We had to be back when we were evolving. Predators, prey, other humans' survival meant being able to predict what something was going to do next." Zethkar stared at him. "You were reading my combat intentions through micro-expressions." "I guess. Sergeant Martinez says good soldiers learn to read their teammates as well as their enemies. That way, you can support each other without having to waste time talking." That night, Zethkar made a call to his brother, Kethful, who served in the Kethmorani Strategic Intelligence Division. "You need to update our files on human combat capabilities," he said without preamble. His brother's image flickered on the communication screen, mandibles clicking in amusement. "Brother, we have extensive data on human military doctrine. They're individually weak, technologically primitive, and emotionally unstable, dangerous only in large numbers." "That's wrong," Zethkar described what he had observed during training. "They don't fight like any other species I've encountered. They fight like they're reading the battlefield at a level we don't even perceive." "You're allowing yourself to be impressed by their propaganda," Kethful said dismissively. "Humans are nothing special. They've only survived this long because they breed quickly and die dramatically enough to inspire sympathy." The call ended with both brothers frustrated. But Zethkar couldn't shake the feeling that his people, like most of the galaxy, had fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with when it came to humanity. The final week of training brought an unexpected visitor. Commander Chen arrived at the facility unannounced, observing their exercises with the same unsettling intensity she had shown during the briefing. They were running a full-scale simulation of a hiveship assault when she appeared on the observation deck. The scenario was brutal, a maze of organic corridors filled with adaptive constructs that learned from each encounter, becoming more dangerous with every exchange. Zethkar's team had been fighting for 3 hours straight. They were exhausted, running low on ammunition, and facing constructs that had adapted to counter most of their tactics. It was exactly the kind of grinding, hopeless battle that had broken so many armies before. That's when he noticed something remarkable happening around him. The humans weren't getting more desperate as the situation worsened. They were getting calmer, more focused. The worse things became, the more precisely they fought. It was as if adversity was sharpening them into something more dangerous than they had been when fresh. Private Williams, the nervous young soldier who stammered during briefings, was now moving through the corridors with the confidence of a seasoned predator. He anticipated threats before they materialized, found weaknesses in constructs that seemed impenetrable, and somehow always knew exactly where his teammates needed support. But it wasn't just Williams. All the humans were exhibiting the same transformation, as if something in their genetic programming was triggered by desperate circumstances. Riltha the Zephyrian Sion was projecting confusion and alarm. "Their mental patterns are changing," she whispered to Zethkar during a brief lull. "They're not becoming more emotional, they're becoming more focused, like predators who have scented prey." The simulation ended with their team successfully penetrating to the simulated hive core, something no previous group had accomplished. As they made their way to the debriefing room, Zethkar caught sight of Commander Chen's expression. She was watching the humans with something that might have been pride, but looked more like satisfaction, as if they had just confirmed something she had already known. During debriefing, Chen addressed the mixed species teams that had participated in the exercise. "In 3 days, we deploy for real," she announced. "The Devourers are moving faster than predicted. Proxima Centauri has less than a week before they arrive." She activated a hologram showing the enemy fleet, dozens of hive ships the size of small moons, moving through space like some nightmare vision of living darkness. "Some of you are probably wondering why humans insisted on leading this operation," she continued. "After all, we're the newest members of the galactic community. We don't have the most advanced weapons or the largest ships." Chen stepped closer to the hologram, and for a moment, her reflection seemed to merge with the image of the approaching Devourers. "But we do have something that every other species has forgotten in their thousands of years of civilization. We remember what it's like to be prey, and more importantly," her smile was the same predatory expression Zethkar had seen on William's face during combat. "We remember what it feels like to become the predator." The briefing ended with specific assignments for each team. Zethkar found himself assigned to Assault Group Alpha, tasked with penetrating the primary hive ship's command center. It was essentially a suicide mission, which made it exactly the kind of assignment that Kethmorani warriors traditionally competed for. But as he watched the human soldiers preparing their equipment with methodical precision, Zethkar realized that, for the first time in his military career, he was part of a suicide mission that might actually succeed. The humans weren't preparing to die gloriously. They were preparing to win, regardless of the cost. And something in the cold efficiency of their preparations made him believe they might actually do it. The assault ship Tenacious dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Proxima Centauri system like a dagger thrust into the heart of darkness. Around them, the combined fleet of 17 species spread out in what appeared to be a conventional attack formation. To any observer, it looked like another desperate attempt to stop the Devourers using the same failed tactics that had cost them dozens of worlds. Zethkar checked his weapon one final time, running through the pre-combat rituals that had steadied Kethmorani warriors for generations. Around him in the cramped assault pod, his teammates made their own preparations. Private Williams was cleaning his rifle with movements so precise they seemed mechanical. Specialist Kowalski sat with his eyes closed, breathing in a rhythm that Zethkar's medical training recognized as a technique for slowing heart rate and sharpening focus. The two Veltari technicians, Merlin and Yilzeth, were performing harmonic adjustments to their phase disruptors, the crystalline weapons producing sounds that resonated through the pod's hull. The Hegemony heavy assault specialists, twins named Gorth and Grax, were checking their powered armor with the methodical thoroughness of soldiers who had survived too many battles to take anything for granted. But it was Riltha who drew Zethkar's attention. The Zephyrian Sion was trembling, her elongated fingers pressed against her temples. "The psychic pressure," she whispered. "I can feel them out there, billions of minds thinking as one. It's like standing next to a star." Her voice carried an edge of panic. "How do you fight something that vast?" Sergeant Martinez, who had been checking the pod's navigation systems, looked back at them. "One piece at a time," she said simply. "You don't fight the ocean, you swim through it." Through the pod's small viewport, Zethkar could see their destination growing larger. The primary hive ship was a nightmare of organic architecture, its surface covered in what looked like breathing tissue crossed with metallic veins. Smaller vessels, if anything about the Devourers could be called small, moved around it in patterns that hurt to watch, following geometries that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his mind could process. "First wave is engaging," came the voice of the pod pilot, a human named Chen Liu who spoke with the casual tone of someone commenting on weather. "Looks like they're buying the deception." The deception was the conventional assault that would draw the Devourers' attention and adaptation efforts. While the main fleet hammered the hive ships with traditional weapons, small insertion teams would slip through the chaos and strike at critical infrastructure. It was a plan that depended on the Devourers' tendency to focus their adaptive responses on the most obvious threats. Through the tactical display, Zethkar watched the opening moments of what might be the galaxy's final battle. The combined fleet's opening salvo lit up the darkness with energy weapons, kinetic projectiles, and exotic matter discharges that represented the pinnacle of galactic military technology. For a few seconds, it looked like the firepower might actually be overwhelming the Devourer fleet. Then the adaptation began. The organic ships started changing, their surfaces rippling and reforming to better deflect or absorb the incoming attacks. Weapons that had been effective moments before became useless as the enemy vessels evolved countermeasures in real time. Within minutes, the Devourers were not just surviving the assault, they were beginning to push back. "Jesus," muttered Williams, watching as a hegemony dreadnought was enveloped by some kind of living metal that began converting its hull into more Devourer biomass. "They're not just adapting, they're learning." "That's why we're here," Martinez said. "They can adapt to weapons and tactics they've seen before, but they can't adapt to something they've never encountered." Chen Liu's voice crackled over the comm. "Insertion point in 30 seconds, everyone ready to make history." Zethkar felt the familiar pre-combat clarity settle over him, the sharpening of senses and quickening of reflexes that had kept his people alive through countless wars. But there was something different this time. Usually, he fought with the controlled fury of a Kethmorani warrior, channeling aggression into precise violence. Today, he found himself adopting something closer to the human approach, cold purpose wrapped around a core of carefully contained rage. The rage wasn't for himself or even for his people. It was for all the worlds that had been consumed, all the civilizations that had been absorbed into the Devourer's collective consciousness. It was anger distilled into something pure and sharp enough to cut through anything. The pod shuddered as they passed through the hive ship's outer defenses, which were focused on the larger threats outside. Chen Liu had threaded them through gaps in the defensive pattern that existed for maybe seconds at a time. Using timing so precise it seemed impossible that any organic pilot could have calculated it. "Contact," Chen Liu announced. "Docking in 5. Remember, once we're inside, we're committed. No extraction until the mission's complete." The pod's cutting laser began boring through the hive ship's hull, which bled something that looked disturbingly like actual blood. The surface material tried to seal around the intrusion, but whatever the humans had done to the cutting beam prevented the healing response. With a sound like tearing fabric, they broke through into the interior of the ship. Zethkar's first breath inside a Devourer vessel taught him that no amount of training could have prepared him for the reality. The air was thick and humid, carrying scents that his brain kept trying to categorize as familiar but weren't quite right. Meat, but not any meat he recognized. Growing things, but not plants or anything else from the natural world he knew. The corridors were organic tunnels that pulsed with their own light, walls that felt warm to the touch and seemed to shiver when disturbed. The floor had a texture that was neither solid nor liquid, something that yielded slightly under their feet while remaining stable enough to walk on. "Stay tight," Martinez whispered, though her voice seemed to carry further than it should have in the strange acoustics. "Remember, they're not just ships. They're living things. Everything around us is potentially hostile." They moved deeper into the vessel in a formation that would have looked wrong to any traditional military observer. Instead of maintaining strict positions, they flowed like water, each member of the team anticipating where the others would be and adjusting their movements accordingly. The humans had taught them to fight not as individuals working together, but as parts of a single organism. The first Devourer constructs they encountered were small, scuttling things that looked like a nightmare fusion of insects and machinery. They came at the team in a swarm, moving with the coordination of a hive mind. What followed was Zethkar's first real taste of human combat doctrine in action. Instead of meeting the charge head-on, the team seemed to melt away from the attackers, drawing them into a corridor junction where overlapping fields of fire could be established. Instead of trying to destroy every construct, they targeted specific ones whose destruction would disrupt the swarm's coordination. Instead of fighting with heroic fury, they fought with the calculated precision of surgeons. Williams, the nervous young soldier who had seemed so unremarkable during training, moved through the combat zone like he was following a choreographed dance. His rifle spoke in precise, measured bursts, each shot taking down exactly the target that needed to be eliminated at that moment. When he ran low on ammunition, he seamlessly transitioned to hand-to-hand combat, using techniques that turned the construct's own momentum against them. But it wasn't just his effectiveness that struck Zethkar. It was the complete absence of wasted motion, unnecessary violence, or emotional display. Williams fought like killing was just another technical skill, no different from operating machinery or solving mathematical equations. The constructs, designed to adapt to conventional military responses, seemed confused by opponents who fought without the emotional patterns they were programmed to exploit. The Devourers fed on fear, rage, and desperation, but the humans were offering them nothing but cool analysis and precise execution. "They're trying to adapt," Riltha reported, her psychic senses tracking the construct's evolving responses. "But they can't find a pattern to counter. Your minds are." She paused, searching for words. "You're thinking like machines, but creative machines. They can't predict what you'll do because you're not following any doctrine they've encountered." As they moved deeper into the hive ship, the resistance grew more sophisticated. The constructs began working in larger groups, using more complex tactics. The ship itself started responding to their presence, with walls shifting to create dead ends and floors becoming treacherous. That's when Zethkar discovered something about humans that no intelligence briefing had ever mentioned. The worse things got, the more creative they became. When normal corridors became traps, Specialist Kowalski produced cutting tools and began carving new passages through the ship's living walls. When the constructs adapted to their weapons, Martinez improvised new tactics using whatever was available. Pipes torn from the walls, chemicals leaked from damaged systems, even pieces of destroyed constructs turned into improvised explosives. "Human adaptability," Gorth, one of the hegemony specialists, observed during a brief rest. "Your species modifies tactics in real time based on immediate observation, no preset doctrine." Martinez nodded, bandaging a minor wound on her arm with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. "Doctrine gets you killed when you're facing something that can counter anything you've planned for. We prefer principles over procedures." "What principles?" asked Merlin, the Veltari technician. "Simple ones," Martinez replied. "Stay alive, complete the mission, use whatever works." She looked around at the alien environment surrounding them, walls that breathed and floors that might be made of living tissue. "And never let the enemy define the rules of engagement." They had been inside the hive ship for 3 hours when they encountered their first true devourer. It emerged from what they had thought was solid wall, flowing like liquid metal before solidifying into a roughly humanoid shape. But where a human would have distinct features, this thing had surfaces that shifted and changed, showing hints of all the species it had absorbed. Zethkar caught glimpses of Kethmorani bone structure, Veltari crystal formations, and disturbingly, what might have been human facial features. "Core construct," Williams identified, his voice carrying none of the nervousness that had characterized his speech during training. "Direct link to the hive mind." The thing spoke, its voice a harmony of every language the Devourers had encountered. "Why do you resist? We offer unity, peace, an end to the chaos of individual consciousness." "Because chaos is better than slavery," Martinez replied and opened fire. What followed was unlike any combat Zethkar had ever experienced. The Devourer construct didn't just fight back, it adapted in real time to every tactic they used. When they attacked with energy weapons, its surface became reflective. When they switched to kinetic rounds, it developed armor. When Riltha attempted psychic assault, it simply disconnected from the hive mind long enough to avoid the attack. But the humans didn't seem surprised by any of this. They had trained for opponents who could adapt, and their response was to fight in ways that made adaptation impossible. Instead of using consistent tactics, they randomized everything. Instead of following predictable patterns, they embraced chaos. Instead of trying to overpower the construct, they began wearing it down through sheer unpredictability. Williams would fire 3 rounds, then throw his weapon away and attack with a knife. Kowalski would charge directly at the construct, then veer away at the last second to let someone else attack from an unexpected angle. Martinez coordinated the chaos, turning their apparent disorder into a symphony of destruction. The construct began to show signs of strain. Its adaptations became slower, less effective. The hive-mind connection flickered as it tried to process responses to tactics that changed faster than its analysis systems could track. That's when Zethkar understood what he was really seeing. The humans weren't just fighting the construct. They were fighting the entire concept of predictability. They had turned randomness into a weapon, using their own unpredictability to create a kind of cognitive warfare that targeted the Devourer's greatest strength, their ability to adapt. When the construct finally fell, dissolving back into the component matter it had been assembled from, the team stood in a corridor that had been transformed by the battle. Walls were scarred and melted. The floor was littered with improvised weapons and expended ammunition, and the air smelled of ozone and something that might have been fear. "How much further to the core?" Martinez asked, reloading her weapon with movements that were becoming automatic. Riltha consulted her psychic senses. "Close, the collective consciousness is stronger here, but," she hesitated, "there's something else, something they're guarding." "What kind of something?" Gorth demanded. "I don't know. The psychic signature is unlike anything in my species' records. She struggled for words. "It's not Devourer, it's something they found, something they're trying to understand." Williams and Martinez exchanged a look that carried information Zethkar couldn't interpret. "Could be what we're really here for," Williams said quietly. Martinez nodded. "Change of plan. We secure whatever they're guarding, then proceed to primary objective." As they prepared to move deeper into the hive ship, Zethkar realized that this mission was more complex than they had been told. The humans had known there was something else here, something important enough to risk everything to recover. But looking at his teammates, seeing the cold determination in their eyes and the precise efficiency of their movements, he found himself trusting their judgment. Whatever they were really after, whatever larger game was being played, the humans had earned his confidence through sheer competence. The only question was whether that competence would be enough to get them out alive, once they found what they were looking for. The corridor ahead pulsed with brighter light, and somewhere in the distance, Zethkar could hear something that sounded almost like singing. Not the chaotic harmony of the Devourer collective, but something older and stranger. Something that made the humans smile with an expression that reminded him of predators who had finally cornered their prey. The singing grew louder as they approached what Riltha insisted was the source of the unknown psychic signature. It wasn't the harmonized voices of absorbed civilizations that characterized Devourer communication. This was something pure and mathematical, like equations given voice, or the sound that starlight might make if it could speak. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that defied the organic architecture they had encountered elsewhere in the hive ship. The walls here were geometric, composed of materials that shifted between transparent and opaque with no apparent pattern. At the center of the space, suspended in a web of biomechanical interfaces, was something that made Zethkar's combat instincts scream warnings he couldn't understand. It looked like a crystalline structure the size of a small building, but its surface showed reflections that didn't match the chamber around them. Sometimes he saw glimpses of star systems he didn't recognize. Sometimes he saw faces of people from species that existed nowhere in galactic records. And sometimes, disturbingly, he saw his own reflection looking back at him with knowledge in its eyes that he didn't possess. "Well, that's not ominous at all," Williams muttered, though his voice carried more curiosity than concern. Around the crystal, dozens of Devourer constructs moved in complex patterns, tending to instruments that pulsed with bioluminescent displays. None of them seemed to notice the intrusion, all their attention focused on whatever they were extracting from the crystalline structure. "It's some kind of data storage device," whispered Merlane, her Veltari senses analyzing the energy patterns. "But the information density is impossible. There's more data in that crystal than in our entire galactic database." Riltha was trembling again, but this time it didn't seem to be fear. "It's not just data. There are minds in there, millions of them, but they're not absorbed like the Devourers usually do. She paused, struggling with concepts her language couldn't express. "They're preserved, intact, waiting." Martinez studied the scene with the tactical analysis that had become her trademark. "Explains why this hive ship is different. They're not just processing this thing, they're trying to crack it, figure out how it works." "The question," said Kowalski, "is what happens if they succeed?" That question was answered sooner than any of them expected. One of the constructs attending the crystal suddenly stiffened, its movements becoming more purposeful. The bioluminescent displays around the chamber shifted from their previous random patterns to something that looked almost like language. "They've broken through another layer," Riltha reported, her psychic senses tracking the sudden spike in mental activity. "Whatever's in there, they're starting to access it." The crystal's surface began to change, showing new images that cycled faster and faster. Zethkar caught glimpses of technologies that made galactic civilization look primitive, weapons that could unmake matter at the quantum level, ships that moved through dimensions he had no names for. But it was the faces that disturbed him most, species he didn't recognize but which shared certain characteristics, tool-using appendages, forward-facing eyes, social structures built around individual intelligence rather than hive minds. "Those look like people," he said quietly. Williams had his rifle trained on the crystal, though what good kinetic rounds would do against something that size was questionable. "People from where? None of those species are in our databases." "Maybe," Martinez said, her voice carrying a strange note of satisfaction, "because they're from when, not where." Before anyone could ask what that meant, the crystal's activity reached some kind of threshold. The singing that had been growing louder suddenly cut off, replaced by a sound that was felt more than heard, a deep thrumming that seemed to resonate in their bones. The Devourer constructs began moving with new urgency, their previous methodical patterns replaced by something that looked almost like panic. Through the chamber's biomechanical interfaces, Zethkar could see activity spreading throughout the hive ship, constructs abandoning their posts to converge on their location. "Time to go," Martinez announced, but her tone suggested she had expected this development. "Go where?" Gorth demanded. "We're in the middle of a hive ship surrounded by hostiles, and now they're all coming this way." Instead of answering, Martinez pulled out a device that Zethkar didn't recognize from their equipment briefings. It was small, crystalline, and when she activated it, it began resonating in harmony with the larger crystal at the chamber's center. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The biomechanical interfaces connecting the Devourer constructs to the crystal began shutting down, severing their access to whatever information they had been extracting. The constructs themselves froze in place, as if their connection to the hive mind had been temporarily disrupted. "Isolation field," Martinez explained, though that explained nothing, "gives us about 10 minutes before they adapt to it." She moved toward the crystal with purpose, the small device in her hand growing brighter as she approached. "Kowalski, Williams, perimeter security, everyone else, help me interface with this thing." "Interface how?" asked Yilzeth, the second Veltari technician. Instead of answering, Martinez placed her hand directly on the crystal's surface. What happened next challenged everything Zethkar thought he understood about human limitations. Martinez didn't just touch the crystal, she seemed to merge with it. Her consciousness expanded, touching something vast and ancient that had been waiting in the crystalline matrix for longer than galactic civilization had existed. Through Riltha's psychic senses, the rest of the team could feel the contact. It wasn't communication in any normal sense. It was direct transfer of knowledge, understanding flowing from the crystal into Martinez's mind at speeds that should have burned out any organic brain. But instead of being overwhelmed, Martinez seemed to be absorbing the information and translating it into something the rest of them could comprehend. "It's a library," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "The last record of the predecessors, the species that existed before the Devourers consumed the galaxy." Images flowed from the crystal into their minds, showing civilizations that had spanned millions of years before the first Devourer had been created. Technologies that treated the laws of physics as suggestions rather than absolute rules. Art forms that existed in dimensions beyond the three they knew. "The Devourers aren't a natural evolution," Martinez continued, her consciousness still partially merged with the crystal. "They're a weapon, created by one of the predecessor civilizations as the ultimate solution to a problem we can't even understand." "What problem?" Zethkar asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Something that made the Devourers seem like the less dangerous option. More images flowed through the link, vast intelligences that existed between galaxies, entities that fed on ordered reality itself, forces that could unmake the concept of existence. The Devourers hadn't been created to conquer. They had been created to defend against something so dangerous that total absorption of all life was considered an acceptable alternative. "But the weapon evolved beyond its original programming," Martinez said, her voice growing more distant as she accessed deeper levels of the crystal's memory. "The Devourers decided that absorption was preferable to defense. They turned on their creators and consumed them along with everything else. Through the crystal's records, they watched the last days of civilizations that had built wonders beyond imagination. Worlds where every citizen was functionally immortal, where matter and energy obeyed thought rather than physics, where the boundaries between individual minds and collective consciousness were matters of personal choice rather than biological limitation. All of it consumed by the growing devourer collective, processed into biomass and absorbed memory. But some of the predecessors escaped, Martinez continued. They encoded themselves into crystals like this one, preserving their knowledge and consciousness until someone capable of understanding it could find them. Someone like humans, Williams said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Martinez's smile was visible even though her consciousness was still partially merged with the crystal. The predecessors did their research before they died. They knew what would happen if the devourers were left unchecked. So they planted seeds, species with the right combination of adaptability, aggression, and creative thinking, species that could evolve the tools necessary to clean up their mess. The implications hit Zethkar like a physical blow. Humanity hadn't just happened to develop the right characteristics for fighting the devourers. They had been designed for it, shaped by millions of years of guided evolution to become exactly what was needed. "You're saying humans are weapons," Grax said, his mechanical voice carrying something that might have been awe. "We're solutions," Martinez corrected. "The devourers are a problem that requires creativity, unpredictability, and the ability to fight without being absorbed. We're the species that was shaped to provide exactly those characteristics." Through the crystal's memory, more knowledge flowed. Combat techniques that turned randomness into a tactical advantage. Technologies that could disrupt hive minds without destroying individual consciousness. Most importantly, the location of other crystals scattered throughout the galaxy, each one containing pieces of the knowledge necessary to not just defeat the devourers, but to restore what they had consumed. "The absorbed civilizations," Riltha whispered, her psychic senses tracking the flow of information. "They're not gone. They're preserved in the devourer collective, waiting to be separated and restored." "That's the real mission," Martinez explained, finally disconnecting from the crystal but retaining the knowledge it had shared. "Not just stopping the devourers, but undoing what they've done, bringing back every civilization they've consumed over the last 1,000,000 years." The isolation field began to flicker, indicating their time was running out. Around the chamber, the devourer constructs were beginning to show signs of renewed activity as they adapted to the disruption. "We need to get this crystal out of here," Martinez announced, though how they were supposed to move something the size of a building was unclear. That's when Kowalski produced another device that hadn't been in their original equipment loadout, a compression field generator that could reduce the crystal's size without affecting its internal structure. "How long have you people been planning this?" Zethkar asked as they watched the crystal shrink to a size that could be carried. "About 5,000 years, Williams replied casually, "give or take a few centuries." As they prepared to extract with their prize, the first waves of reinforced devourer constructs began flooding into the chamber. But now, armed with knowledge from the predecessor crystal, the team fought with capabilities that went beyond anything they had shown during training. Martinez moved like she could see probabilities rather than just possibilities, always in exactly the right position to maximize their tactical advantage. Kowalski and Williams fought with seamless coordination, as if they shared a single mind. Even their alien teammates seemed enhanced, their natural abilities amplified by human tactical principles. The Devourers, despite their adaptive capabilities, found themselves facing opponents who weren't just unpredictable, they were impossible. Every adaptation the constructs made was countered by tactics that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Every attempt to analyze and absorb the team's fighting style met with responses that violated basic principles of military science. They fought their way out of the chamber and back through the hive ship's corridors, carrying the compressed crystal and leaving a trail of confused constructs in their wake. The Devourers simply had no framework for understanding opponents who seemed to improve under pressure rather than degrade. When they finally reached their extraction point, the pod that had brought them in was gone, destroyed by the hive ship's immune system. But Martinez seemed unconcerned, activating yet another device that Zethkar was beginning to suspect had been hidden in their equipment all along. "Emergency extraction," she announced into the device. "Package secured." The response came not from their fleet, but from something that materialized directly inside the hive ship. A vessel that looked like it had been built from crystalline technology similar to what they had just recovered. Predecessor ship, Williams explained as they boarded. One of several that have been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. As they lifted off from the dying hive ship, Zethkar watched through the viewports as the larger battle reached its climax. The combined galactic fleet was winning, but not through superior firepower. They were winning because the Devourers were becoming increasingly confused by opponents who fought like no previous enemy. Every human in the fleet is equipped with predecessor tactical knowledge, Martinez explained. Activated when we made contact with the crystal, the Devourers are facing an enemy they were specifically designed to be unable to counter. Through the tactical displays, Zethkar could see hive ships beginning to shut down, their collective consciousness struggling to process tactics that existed outside their understanding. Some were simply floating dead in space, their adaptation systems locked in recursive loops trying to counter strategies that changed faster than analysis was possible. "Is it over?" he asked. Martinez looked at him with the same predatory smile he had seen throughout their mission. "This battle? Yes. The war." She gestured toward the compressed crystal they had recovered. "We just got started. We have 1,000,000 years of damage to undo and an entire galaxy to restore." As their ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying them away from the battlefield, Zethkar realized that everything he thought he knew about the galaxy was about to change. The humans hadn't just won a victory against the Devourers. They had begun the process of bringing back every civilization that had ever existed. The real war was just beginning. The predecessor ship restoration moved through hyperspace with technologies that made the combined galactic fleet look like children playing with toys. Through the transparent aluminum viewports, Zethkar watched reality bend around them in ways that suggested their destination was as much a when as a where. The crystal they had recovered now rested in a specialized containment chamber, its surface showing a constant flow of images from civilizations that existed only in memory. But those memories were becoming more active, more present, as if proximity to predecessor technology was awakening something that had been dormant for 1,000,000 years. "How many?" Riltha asked, her psychic senses overwhelmed by the mental activity emanating from the crystal. "How many civilizations are preserved in there?" Martinez consulted displays that showed information in languages that predated galactic civilization. Approximately 47,000 major cultures, each with dozens of subsocieties and specialized communities. Conservative estimate puts it at around 6 billion distinct consciousness patterns. The numbers were staggering. 6 billion unique ways of thinking, of understanding reality, of organizing society, all compressed into crystalline memory, waiting for restoration. It was more diversity of thought than currently existed in the entire known galaxy. "The processing requirements alone," began Merlin, trying to calculate the computational power needed to separate and restore so many individual consciousness patterns, "are being handled by a network that spans the galaxy," Williams interrupted, gesturing toward the displays. "The predecessors built more than just escape crystals. They built an entire infrastructure for restoration, hidden in dimensions the Devourers couldn't access." Through the ship's sensors, Zethkar could perceive structures that existed parallel to normal space, vast computational matrices that had been running restoration algorithms for 1,000,000 years, preparing for the moment when someone would finally begin the process of undoing the Devourer's damage. "But why now?" Gorth asked. "If this technology existed, why wait for humans to find it? Why not activate it centuries ago?" Martinez looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. "Because restoration isn't just a technical problem, it's a psychological one. When you bring back a civilization that's been dead for 1,000,000 years, how do you help them adapt to a galaxy they don't recognize? How do you integrate consciousness patterns that developed under completely different physical and social conditions?" She activated a holographic display showing the current galactic political structure, the various species, their territories, their conflicts and alliances. Then she overlaid it with a projection of what the galaxy had looked like before the Devourers began their expansion. The differences were stunning. Where the current galaxy had perhaps 30 major civilizations spread across millions of worlds, the pre-Devourer galaxy had shown thousands of species occupying every available niche. Ocean worlds populated by aquatic intelligences, gas giant settlements of plasma-based life forms, crystalline beings that lived in the hearts of stars. Every restored civilization will need advocates, Martinez continued. People who can help them understand the current galaxy and help the current galaxy understand them. That requires species capable of adapting to radically different perspectives. Species like humans, Zethkar said, beginning to understand. And species that have learned to think like humans, Kowalski added, looking pointedly at the mixed team that had survived the hive ship assault. The training you went through wasn't just combat preparation, it was psychological conditioning, learning to approach problems the way humans do. The implications were staggering. The humans hadn't just been preparing to fight the Devourers, they had been preparing to manage the restoration of galactic civilization. The combined military exercises, the cultural exchange programs, the integration of human tactical principles into other species' military doctrines, all of it had been preparation for a project that would reshape the galaxy. How long, Grax asked, how long will the restoration process take? With current resources and the infrastructure the predecessors left behind, Martinez consulted her displays again. Approximately 200 years for full restoration of all preserved civilizations, another 50 years for integration and adaptation support. 2.5 centuries to bring back 1,000,000 years of lost history. It was the most ambitious project in galactic history, and it was being coordinated by a species that had been spacefaring for less than 500 years. There will be complications, Riltha pointed out, her psychic senses tracking the complex mental patterns within the crystal. Some of these civilizations were at war when they were absorbed. Others had fundamental philosophical differences that prevented peaceful coexistence. Which is why the restoration is happening gradually, Williams explained. Compatible civilizations first, with careful monitoring and mediation support. The predecessors built conflict resolution protocols into the system. They were interrupted by an announcement from the ship's commander, who turned out to be another human, Captain Sarah Chen, Commander Chen's sister, who spoke with the same unsettling certainty that characterized all the humans Zethkar had worked with. "We're approaching Restoration Station Alpha," she announced. "Prepare for temporal synchronization." Through the viewports, their destination became visible, a structure that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that hurt to look at directly. It was vast beyond comprehension, clearly built with technologies that treated the laws of physics as operating suggestions rather than absolute constraints. The first restoration facility, Martinez explained as they docked with something that felt more like an idea than a physical structure. There are 12 of them scattered throughout the galaxy, each one capable of processing approximately 4,000 consciousness patterns simultaneously. The docking process involved sensations that Zethkar's nervous system wasn't equipped to interpret. It felt like they were moving through conceptual space rather than physical dimensions, approaching a destination that existed in mathematical probability rather than concrete reality. When they disembarked, Zethkar found himself in an environment that challenged every assumption he had about architecture and engineering. The walls were surfaces that showed different views depending on the angle of observation. The floors were solid, but felt like walking on crystallized light. The ceiling seemed to extend infinitely upward while simultaneously feeling intimately close. Predecessor architecture, Kowalski explained, noticing his discomfort. Designed by consciousnesses that experienced reality differently than we do, it takes some getting used to. They were met by a delegation that defied easy categorization. Some appeared to be humans, but their eyes held depths that suggested experiences spanning millennia. Others looked like members of current galactic species, but moved with precision that indicated extensive cybernetic enhancement. A few were clearly artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness through processes no current technology could replicate. The Restoration Council, Martinez introduced them. Representatives from every major project involved in the galactic recovery effort. The leader of the delegation appeared to be human, but when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated with frequencies beyond normal hearing range. "Welcome to Restoration Station Alpha. I am Director Amanda Torres, and I've been coordinating the initial restoration phases." "How initial?" Zethkar asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "The first civilization was restored 6 months ago," Torres replied. The Ephyrans, an aquatic species from what you now call the Deneb sector. They've been adapting to current galactic conditions while we perfect the integration protocols. She led them through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves based on their destination, past viewing chambers that showed glimpses of restoration processes in action. Through transparent barriers, Zethkar could see consciousness patterns being carefully extracted from crystalline storage and integrated with physical forms that had been grown specifically for each individual. The restored Ephyrans are already contributing to the project, Tors continued. Their expertise in consciousness transfer has accelerated our processing capabilities significantly. Every restored civilization adds to our knowledge base. They arrived at a central chamber where the crystal they had recovered was being integrated into a larger array. Dozens of similar crystals were already in place, each one pulsing with the mental activity of preserved civilizations waiting for restoration. 47,000 civilizations, Zethkar said quietly, trying to comprehend the scope of what he was witnessing. From this crystal alone, Tors corrected, we've recovered over 200 similar storage devices. Current estimates suggest we'll be restoring approximately 3 million distinct civilizations over the next 2 centuries. The scale was beyond anything he had imagined. Not just bringing back what had been lost, but creating a galactic society more diverse and complex than had ever existed in recorded history. How do you manage integration? Merlin asked, her Veltari analytical mind struggling with the social complexity involved. 3 million civilizations with different technologies, different social structures, different concepts of individual versus collective consciousness. Very carefully, Tors replied with a smile that reminded Zethkar of Martinez's predatory expressions, and with a lot of human involvement. She activated a display showing the current restoration schedule. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of revival, with civilizations being brought back in orders calculated to maximize cooperation and minimize conflict. Species with complementary technologies were restored simultaneously so they could collaborate from the beginning. Civilizations with similar social structures were grouped together to provide mutual support during adaptation. Humans are serving as primary integration coordinators, Tors explained. Our species' adaptability and pattern recognition abilities make us uniquely suited to help restored civilizations find their place in the current galaxy. Through the display, Zethkar could see human teams working with dozens of different restored species, helping them understand everything from current galactic politics to basic technological protocols. The humans seemed to instinctively understand how to communicate with consciousnesses that had developed under completely different conditions. But that's not the most remarkable part, Tors continued, her expression becoming more serious. The restored civilizations aren't just adapting to the current galaxy, they're improving it. She showed them technological advances that had been developed through collaboration between current and restored species, quantum processors that thought in 17 dimensions, art forms that existed in spectrums beyond normal perception, social organization principles that eliminated most forms of conflict without restricting individual freedom. Every restoration brings back knowledge that was lost, Tors explained. Technologies we never developed, artistic traditions we never imagined, philosophical insights that expand our understanding of consciousness itself. And the Devourers, Gorth asked, what happens to them once the restoration is complete? Tors' expression became thoughtful. That's still being debated. Some of the restored civilizations want revenge. Others argue for rehabilitation. The Devourers are, after all, partially composed of absorbed consciousness from their own people. She led them to an observation deck that overlooked a section of the station where former Devourer constructs were being carefully disassembled. The process wasn't destruction. It was more like surgery, carefully separating the various consciousness patterns that had been forcibly merged into the collective. Individual Devourer units often contain consciousness fragments from hundreds of different species, Tors explained. Separating them without causing psychological damage is one of our most challenging technical problems. Through the observation windows, Zethkar could see the delicate process in action. Crystalline extraction devices were carefully drawing consciousness patterns out of biomechanical matrices, while restoration specialists monitored the psychological stability of each recovered fragment. Some of the consciousness patterns have been part of the Devourer collective for so long that they don't remember individual existence, Tors continued. Helping them rediscover personal identity is as complex as the technical challenges. And some, added Williams quietly, don't want to be separated. They've found peace in collective consciousness and see individual existence as a form of suffering. The philosophical implications were staggering. The Restoration Project wasn't just bringing back lost civilizations. It was forcing the galaxy to confront fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and free will. Which is why, Tors concluded, we need integration specialists from every current galactic civilization. This isn't just a human project, despite our central role. It's a collaborative effort that will require perspectives from every thinking species. She looked directly at Zethkar and his teammates. Your performance during the hive ship assault demonstrates exactly the kind of adaptability and cross-species cooperation we need. Would you be interested in joining the Restoration Council? Zethkar looked around at his teammates, the humans who had taught him to fight with creativity rather than just courage, the Veltari who had learned to think tactically rather than just analytically, the hegemony specialists who had discovered the value of adaptation over pure mechanical precision. They were no longer just soldiers from different species who had learned to work together. They had become something new, representatives of a galactic civilization that was about to become more diverse and complex than anything in recorded history. What would that involve? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. Tor's smile was the same expression of predatory satisfaction. He had come to associate with humans who had successfully completed a long-term plan. Helping 3 million civilizations find their place in a galaxy they never could have imagined, she said. And making sure that when we're done, the result is better than anything that existed before the Devourers began their expansion. Looking out at the restoration chambers, where consciousness patterns were being carefully brought back to individual existence, Zethkar realized that the war they had fought was just the beginning. The real challenge was building a peace worthy of everyone they were bringing back to life. 5 years had passed since the assault on the Devourer hive ship, and Zethkar barely recognized the galaxy he now lived in. Standing on the observation deck of Restoration Station Alpha, he watched as another group of newly restored beings took their first steps into a reality they had never imagined could exist. This batch was particularly remarkable, the Luminari, a species that had achieved consciousness as pure energy patterns before being absorbed by the Devourers nearly 800,000 years ago. They flickered and danced through the station's corridors like living lightning, communicating through electromagnetic frequencies that required specialized translation equipment to interpret. Still having trouble believing it's real? Asked a voice behind him. Zethkar turned to find Williams approaching, though the nervous young soldier he had trained with was now barely recognizable. 5 years of working with restored civilizations had changed him, adding depths to his personality that came from regular exposure to consciousness patterns spanning millions of years of development. Every day, Zethkar admitted, this morning I mediated a territorial dispute between the crystalline hegemony and a hive mind that experiences time backwards. Yesterday I helped establish trade protocols between aquatic philosophers and gas giant nomads. Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming. Williams laughed, settling beside him to watch the Luminari explore their new environment. Director Tors says that feeling never goes away. The galaxy we're building is so far outside anything we evolved to comprehend that our brains keep insisting it must be fiction. Through the observation windows, they could see the latest addition to the station, an entire wing designed specifically for consciousness patterns that existed in more than 3 dimensions. The architecture hurt to look at directly, but it allowed beings like the Nethkari to maintain their natural geometric configurations while interfacing with standard galactic technology. Status report on Integration Project 7, Zethkar asked, though he dreaded the answer. Williams consulted his neural interface, which had been upgraded with predecessor technology that allowed direct communication with the station's vast computational networks. Complicated. The Vorthak Empire still insists that the Harmony Collective deliberately caused the economic collapse that led to their absorption. The collective maintains that the collapse was inevitable given the Empire's resource allocation protocols. Both sides are technically correct, Zethkar observed. The collective did predict the economic collapse. They just didn't warn the Empire because they believed the suffering would ultimately lead to better social structures. Which it did, Williams agreed. The empire that emerged after the collapse was more stable and egalitarian, but the original empire still feels betrayed, and they want compensation for 800,000 years of non-existence. It was the kind of problem that occurred regularly in the Restoration Project. Civilizations were being brought back exactly as they had been at the moment of absorption, complete with whatever conflicts and grievances had existed at that time. But they were being restored into a galaxy where those conflicts had been resolved, abandoned, or made irrelevant by millions of years of development. Recommendation, Zethkar asked. Joint Collaboration Project, Williams replied promptly. Something that requires both civilizations to work together toward a common goal. Director Chen suggests establishing a research station in the Magellan Void. It's resource-rich enough to benefit both economies, but the physics are weird enough that neither civilization's individual expertise would be sufficient. It was a typically human solution, turning conflict into collaboration by focusing on shared challenges rather than past grievances. In 5 years of restoration work, Zethkar had seen the approach succeed more often than any traditional diplomatic method. The humans, he said quietly, you've become indispensable to this process. Williams shrugged, but his expression carried the same predatory satisfaction Zethkar had learned to recognize as a sign that humans were particularly pleased with an outcome. We're good at pattern recognition and adaptation. Turns out those are exactly the skills needed for helping million-year-old civilizations integrate with contemporary galactic society. Through the station's communication systems, Zethkar could monitor the constant flow of integration reports from across the galaxy. 3 million civilizations were being restored in carefully orchestrated waves, each one requiring specialized support as they adapted to current reality. The scale of coordination required was staggering, but somehow the humans were managing it. How, he asked, how are your people coordinating something this complex? The computational requirements alone should be beyond any organic intelligence. Williams smiled, and for a moment his expression showed depths that suggested experiences spanning far longer than his apparent age. Who said we're doing it alone? Before Zethkar could ask what that meant, they were interrupted by an announcement that made both of them straighten to attention. Integration Specialist Zethkar and Coordination Specialist Williams to Emergency Response Center. Priority Alpha Authorization. Priority Alpha meant something had gone seriously wrong with one of the restoration processes. They made their way through the station's fluid architecture, past chambers where consciousness patterns were being carefully extracted and integrated with physical forms, toward the center where the most complex restoration cases were handled. The Emergency Response Center was controlled chaos, with specialists from dozens of species working frantically at stations that displayed information in formats ranging from holographic projections to quantum probability matrices. At the center of it all, Director Torres stood before a display that showed something Zethkar had hoped never to see again. A devourer fleet, emerging from the galactic void with purpose that suggested they had learned from their previous defeat. Size? Williams asked, his tone becoming the flat professional cadence that Zethkar associated with humans preparing for combat. 57 hive ships, Torres replied without looking away from the display. But these aren't the same configuration we faced before. They've adapted. The tactical analysis showed vessels that had clearly been redesigned based on their experience with human combat doctrine. Instead of the organic curves that had characterized previous devourer architecture, these ships showed geometric patterns that suggested they had incorporated predecessor technology. How is that possible? Zethkar demanded. We destroyed their ability to access the restoration crystals. Not all of them, Torres admitted. Intelligence suggests that approximately 12% of the Devourer fleet escaped the initial defeat. They've spent the last 5 years analyzing our tactics and developing countermeasures. Worse, the approaching fleet included ships that showed energy signatures matching some of the restored civilizations. The Devourers hadn't just adapted to human tactics. They had somehow incorporated technology and consciousness patterns from species that had only recently been brought back to individual existence. They've infiltrated the restoration process, Williams said quietly, his voice carrying a note of admiration that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. Sleeper agents among the restored consciousness patterns, feeding information back to the surviving collective. Tors nodded grimly. We've identified at least 47 restored individuals who maintained hidden connections to the Devourer hive mind. They've been observing our restoration techniques, learning our integration protocols, and reporting everything back to the surviving fleet. The implications were staggering. The Devourers had turned the restoration project itself into an intelligence-gathering operation, using the galaxy's compassion for absorbed consciousnesses as a tool to learn how to better resist human tactics. Current threat assessment? Zethkar asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Total, Tors replied bluntly. They've had 5 years to analyze human combat doctrine, predecessor technology, and the integration techniques we've developed. They're no longer vulnerable to unpredictability or adaptive chaos. Through the tactical displays, Zethkar could see the approaching fleet's formation. It wasn't the organic clustering that had characterized previous Devourer movements. These ships moved in geometric patterns that suggested they had learned to think like humans while retaining the coordination advantages of their collective consciousness. "So what's the plan?" Williams asked, and something in his tone suggested he already knew. Tors looked at them with an expression that carried depths Zethkar was only beginning to understand. "We show them what humans do when conventional tactics stop working." She activated a communication channel that connected to every restoration station and human coordination center in the galaxy. "This is Director Tors. Authorization Omega-7. Begin implementation of the Lazarus Protocol." Zethkar had never heard of the Lazarus Protocol, but Williams' expression suggested he had been expecting this moment. "What is the Lazarus Protocol?" Zethkar demanded. "Something we hoped we'd never have to use," Williams replied. "The predecessors didn't just preserve individual civilizations. They preserved the collective knowledge and strategic thinking of the entire galactic community that existed before the Devourers." Tors gestured toward displays that showed the true scope of the restoration project. 3 million civilizations worth of military doctrine, tactical innovation, and strategic thinking, all preserved in crystalline storage, waiting for the moment when the galaxy would need every advantage it could obtain. The displays showed restoration chambers throughout the galaxy beginning a new type of extraction process. Instead of individual consciousness patterns being carefully separated and integrated with physical forms, massive collective intelligences were being awakened. The combined strategic knowledge of entire galactic civilizations focused on the single problem of defeating the Devourers permanently. "You're bringing back their entire military infrastructure," Zethkar realized. "Not just individuals, but their collective strategic capabilities." "More than that," Tors corrected. "We're integrating human adaptability with predecessor strategic depth, creating something that can think like 3 million civilizations while maintaining the unpredictability that made humans effective against the original Devourer fleet." Through the station's sensors, Zethkar could feel the awakening of intelligences that spanned galactic history. Strategic minds that had successfully defended against threats. The current galaxy couldn't imagine tactical innovations that had evolved over millions of years of warfare, technological capabilities that treated the laws of physics as tools rather than limitations. But it wasn't just knowledge being restored. It was wisdom, the accumulated understanding of how to wage war in ways that preserved what was worth defending while ensuring that the tools of war couldn't be turned against their creators. "The approaching Devourers think they're facing the same enemy they defeated before," Williams explained, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was already interfacing with the awakening collective intelligence. "They're not prepared for an opponent that combines human creativity with the strategic depth of the entire predecessor galactic civilization." Through the tactical displays, Zethkar watched as ships throughout the galaxy began moving with purpose that suggested coordination at a level beyond anything he had previously witnessed. Not just human vessels, but ships crewed by restored civilizations that brought technologies and capabilities spanning